Welcome back to the Chad Hasty Show on News Talk, KFYO. Joining us on the phones right now, good friend of the program, Scott Braddock, editor, Quorum Report. Scott, good morning. How are you today?
Doing well, Chad. I'm in Southeast Texas, where the eyes of the nation are on this special House election here at Texas House, District 28. Democrats trying to flip this from Republican to Democratic, and there were stories in the Associated Press across the country, and NBC News had a story, I think, on Saturday about the sort of inside scoop on how the Democrats are going to flip this thing. I'm trying to figure out how in the world they're going to do it, Chad, because look, I'm looking at the numbers. I'm just trying to be dispassionate. You know me. I don't make predictions in these elections.
That's true.
I absolutely refuse to do that. You have tried on many occasions to try to get me to do that, right? So it will maybe surprise the listeners a little bit to hear me so sure about this. I just don't think they can do it. Let me lay it out for you. You have Beto O'Rourke here in Fort Bend County, block walking for Eliz Markowitz, who is the Democratic candidate. Gary Gates is the Republican. Gates has never been previously the preferred candidate of Republicans. He's run for a lot of different things. He's run for Texas House. He's run for Texas Senate. He's run for Railroad Commissioner. Couldn't get out of either primaries or special elections for any of those. It just wasn't the candidate that Republicans went with, but he was the top Republican vote getter in November in the first round of the special election to fill an unexpired term of the former Appropriations Chairman John Zerwas. But looking at the numbers, the Republican in 2018 in this district won the seat by 9 points. Okay, and this is a suburban area. This is, again, Fort Bend County, which, by the way, O'Rourke won Fort Bend County. He carried the county, but in this district, he lost by a few points to Senator Cruz. So that's one data point. I'm looking at some internal polling that shows that Beto has a negative rating in this district of 51%, not insignificant. And also, Governor Abbott, you may have seen the governor bragging about that poll last week that had him around 65% approval for his job rating, something like that.
Right.
In this district, it looks like he's around 66% approval, and Governor Abbott has endorsed the Republican candidate in this. And look, this is one of those deals you'll often see on cable news channels, or there might be a special election, like in a suburb outside of Kansas City, and it had been a Republican seat, and the Democrats are trying to flip it. And the whole story on cable news would be for 48 hours, if they're able to flip it, if the Democrats can win here, they can win anywhere.
Right.
They can win anywhere, right? And so then that, of course, becomes a big fundraising gold mine. Democrats will try to capitalize on that, and they should. I mean, a political party is about getting your candidates elected, right? But if they lose, what will the story be the next day? It'll just go away, right?
Yeah.
It'll be that, that's a Republican seat. They couldn't win that anyway. From what I can see here, Republicans are just doing this, the slow, steady work of campaigning. The Republican candidate has been block walking like a maniac, really. By the way, Gates, I didn't even realize this until I was covering this election. I've covered every other election that he stood for office in. But he's one of these guys who does the Ironman Championship, that contest.
Yeah.
So block walking is not as difficult for him as it is for some other candidates.
No, he's walking around, everybody going, "This is easy. Come on."
This is easy. He's hitting more than 100 doors a day personally, is what I'm told. And I think when it's all said and done, the campaign told me he would have hit something like 11,000 doors personally himself. I can tell you that the Republican consultant who's working on this, ground game is the name of the game with them. By the way, they worked on the Kel Seliger race in that primary the last time, in which he was able to beat two challengers in the Republican primary with no runoff. And they're probably running a similar program in this election. The Democratic group Forward Majority was bragging over the weekend that they were going to spend another $100,000 in this district to try to flip this seat. But look, Gates right out of the gate, put $1 million of his own money into it. He's a wealthy developer here in the Houston area. So a lot of resources pouring in. There are nasty television ads on cable channels here in the district. And I love it, Chad. I mean, it's really getting into be, this is a special election, but it's getting to be primary season. I was kind of joking over the weekend. I did get my first unmarked envelope at the offices of the Quorum Report. It's always can, but, not in this race, but campaigns start bringing us their opposition research, hoping that we would do a story, or either the campaigns or someone maybe tangentially connected to a campaign. So it's about to get nasty. I'm about to put a lot more miles on the truck, traveling around the state, covering all these things, and what's not to like.
When is that special election, by the way?
So the early vote starts this week, and the actual election day is on the 28th, next Tuesday. We're just about a week out.
Okay, all right. And right now, it's you would say it's looking good for the Republicans.
I would say handicap it for the Republican. The campaign, Craig Murphy's the consultant, and he runs a lot of campaigns across the state, by the way, for Republicans. He's been bragging that they have internal polling that shows they're ahead by 12 points, or they were ahead by 12 points, and now they're up by even more than that now after some of the nasty attacks that have been, thrown back and forth here. A lot of mudslinging happening in this race. I think that might be a little optimistic. If I had to guess, it's probably more like 4 or 5 points ahead for the Republican. I mean, who knows? One thing about a special election, and this is why the Democrats should do this. I mean, I would say just from a strategy standpoint, it's probably mostly all upside for Democrats. And by the way, you've had, as I mentioned, national attention on this. Joe Biden has endorsed the Democrat. You had Mike Bloomberg here block walking for the Democrat. Beto O'Rourke, Julian Castro over this past weekend block walking for the Democrat. The reason they're doing that is it's just smart politics. If they win, it's a fundraising goldmine. We can win anywhere if we can win there. But if they lose, then it's like, well, it was a Republican district and who cares? So it's a special election. Anything can happen. In these special elections, who knows who votes? Yeah. Exactly. Who knows who the voters are going to be in early voting this week and on Election Day next Tuesday. But I would still say it's a long shot for Democrats, and we'll all find out together how it turns out.
Have any big-name Republicans been out there?
No, and again, it sort of speaks to what's happening on the GOP side. It's just the slow, steady work of winning a Texas House race. I mean, when these things get national attention, I always kind of chuckle, Chad, because I cover Texas House races. It's a big part of what I do for my living is watch these races unfold. And when there are big names making endorsements and, outside groups trying to influence what's happening in these races, whether that happens on the Republican side with groups like Empower Texans, for example, or whether it happens on the Democratic side with this group like Forward Majority, which is based in New York, they're playing in my turf. Like, I know how this is kind of going to go. And the thing about a Texas House race is it's a local race. Yeah. It's a local race. I mean, the people who live in the area are not looking at that NBC News report. They're not looking at the AP. They probably read the Houston Chronicle. They look at whatever local news, outlets they like to look at here. And a lot of the Republicans are probably watching Fox News Channel where the positive ads for the Republican are running. I can tell you there is a lot of television advertisement here on the cable channels in the Houston area. But as far as getting it done in the Texas House race, it's about direct voter contact. Are you knocking on doors? Are you getting mail pieces to people's houses and things like that? And just reminding them that there's an election at all. Like we were saying, there's no way to know who's going to vote in a January 28th runoff for a Texas House race. So, that's the big question. Who gets their people out to vote? If it's the Republican probably wins.
You made a tweet over the weekend. You were watching Julian Castro.
Yeah.
I guess give a speech about how we're going to turn Texas blue, and I was going to respond to it by saying, I wonder how many Democrats think that would have been more true if someone like a Julian Castro would have run in the U.S. Senate race, because what gave a lot of momentum for the Democrats last time, again, it was a midterm election. It's different than when the president's on the ballot, but they had a big name in the Senate race, and now who cares is leading the Democrat the race. I mean, it's it was just kind of rich, for me to see Julian Castro get up there going, yeah, we're going to turn Texas blue, but I didn't want to have anything to do with that. That's why I didn't run.
I think it's sort of a concession on the part of the Democrats that the way Texas may change is in these local races. I mean, they're not ready to punch through at the statewide level, at least just yet. I mean, The case against Cruz was a little bit easier, right? I mean, there's a lot of anger against President Trump. In 2018, even though they're not on the ballot, the midterm election is always about who's in the White House. In 2010, it was about President Obama, backlash to him. Republicans made gains all over the place. In 2018, Democrats made gains all over the place, with backlash to President Trump. Then there were a lot of Republicans who were not thrilled with Senator Cruz, as as you know, there were 500,000 people who voted for O'Rourke and then voted for Governor Abbott.
Yeah.
Those are not, rabid liberals or anything. Those are just people who maybe don't like Cruz. And who knows what those folks will do, by the way, with a couple of things being different. One, President Trump is on the ballot this year. And two, Cruz is not there, and you have a senator who, has maybe, it's interesting, John Cornyn, who's a member of the leadership in the United States Senate. I think average voters, even Republican and Democratic, sort of activists who maybe don't care as much about the fact that he's in Republican leadership. He has a little bit lower profile than Senator Cruz, for sure, who, of course, ran for president. And we don't have straight ticket voting anymore. And so what happens in these Texas House races, I think it's going to happen race to race, district to district, and how does the Democrat and how does the Republican in each of those districts make their case?
Yeah. Speaking of President Trump, over the weekend he was in Austin, Texas. A quick trip to Austin.
Mm-hmm. Quick trip to Austin. He was speaking to the American Farm Bureau Federation's convention Sunday night at the convention center in downtown Austin. And interesting, this is his 14th trip to Texas as president. I mean, he's outpacing President Obama, President Bush, et cetera. You didn't see them making as many trips. It's a shift, there were some folks saying, well, he comes to Texas to do fundraising, which of course is true, but both Obama and Bush did that as well. You didn't see Obama going to California a lot. He went there, but not as much as President Trump's coming to Texas. It's just a shift, Chad. To see a Republican president who doesn't live in Texas make so many trips to Texas. There's a campaigning aspect to this. When he's giving speeches before the farmers, or when he goes and does the rally in Dallas that you were at last year. There's a couple things going on. One, he likes it, right? He likes to do these rallies. He likes to be all over the place. And, of course, there was some criticism of the way he would do his rallies in 2016. And what did he punch back with? He said, well, nobody, I'm paraphrasing, but he said, well, nobody told Hillary Clinton to not go to Wisconsin, right? And he was in these places where they thought that he could not win. And then he did win in Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, made the difference in the election, changed the electoral map. And so I think it's just noteworthy. His campaign has said that they're confident about Texas. He said as much in his speech over the weekend that the polling shows that he's doing well in Texas. I think if you look out over the horizon, it's not a good narrative for Republicans if the Republican nominee for president in this state finishes with a single-digit lead over the Democrat twice in a row. I think they'd like to increase that to 10, 11, 12 points. You've heard Lieutenant Governor Patrick talk a lot about this. He has said that he thinks that President Trump will do better in Texas than he did last time when he beat Clinton in Texas by 9 points. They would like to, make it not look like a trend line for Democrats that Texas is in play. I, again, don't do predictions, but I could see him doing worse than he did last time based on a few things. But we'll see. They're going to put the president on the ground in Texas. Are they going to put real resources into Texas, run ads and those sorts of things? That's yet to be seen. But we do know that on the Democratic side, Bloomberg, who we mentioned earlier, is going to be putting resources into this state and other places going forward. He's pledged that he's going to spend, many of his millions of dollars in these places that are considered key states, if not swing states, all the way to November, even if Bloomberg isn't the nominee. Yeah. It really does change the math and change the dynamics of how the election is going to work. The Wall Street Journal last week had a story that said that when Bloomberg made his buy in Houston, toward the end of the year, just by putting $1 million of ads on television in the Houston market, and I think his total spend was something like $4 million so far in the Houston market, something like that. I didn't check the very latest report on that. But by making that initial buy, he increased ad rates in the Houston market 45%. Just by doing that, that changes, what the other candidates have to pay for, what they're going to put on the air in this state as they move forward through their own primary and potentially all the way to the general in November. Yeah,
visiting with Scott Braddock, editor, Quorum Report. Scott, I think we maybe have time to get to one more issue before we let you go. And I'm still, even though it's not, it's getting a little bit of press out there, maybe not as much as it should. The big battle for the Texas House. And the money coming in for these Texas House races, how's everything looking?
It's sort of a disjointed effort on both the Republican and Democratic sides at this point. The real consequence of Speaker Bonin's scandal last year that, of course, we reported ad nauseum here on KFYO throughout the year, at least the end of the year, the real consequence is that there's not someone who acts sort of like a general in the war room to try to run things and make sure that the Republicans still have a Republican majority. There are a couple of different groups that are trying to, have an effect on this. Karl Rove was brought in by some of the Texas House Republican chairmen to run a PAC for them, a political action committee. They had originally said, Chad, they were going to raise about $5 million for that effort. And on their first report, they showed, I think, about $480,000. A little bit shy of $5 million. It's early. This is supposed to be something geared toward the November elections, but I would have expected them to do a little bit better than that, maybe show $1 million or $1.5 million coming out of the gate. We'll see how that goes. The Republican caucus raising money, a couple $100,000 in their bank account. As I said earlier, it may simply be that all of these different races are run individually, and with each of the candidates having to make the case for resources individually. On the Democratic side, it's kind of splintered as well. You have one of the chairmen, Trey Martinez-Fisher, who came out and said he had more than $300,000 in the bank to try to not only get through his election, he's in a safe Democratic district in San Antonio, but also to try to flip the House to Democratic. He'd like to, start handing out checks to some of these candidates who are challenging Republicans in districts where the Republicans look vulnerable. You also have the chairman of the House Democratic Caucus, Chris Turner. He showed somewhere in the same neighborhood, over $300,000 in his account. He'll be doing the same kind of thing. You have the House Democratic Campaign Committee. You have these outside groups like Forward Majority, which I mentioned earlier, talking about this Fort Bend race. So they all sort of have the same goal in mind, Chad, but on the Democratic side and the Republican side, it doesn't look like there's a central figure to figure out how those resources will be allocated, which when Speaker Strauss was there, that was a big role for him and his political advisors. They would sit there and go, okay, well, Republicans in DFW need more money there, or Republicans in Houston need more there. In some of these swing districts, they would sort of look at it globally and try to figure out how to beat back the Democrats. And I don't see that sort of gelling happen just yet. It hasn't gelled that there's one figure or one operation to try to figure out how to hold the House, and it may just be playing out district to district, which we'll see who is able to really capitalize on that.
Yeah, tell folks what they can find at Quorum Report.
We'll be tracking all of what's happening with the races that we mentioned, and we're starting to hear our sources this morning and over the weekend were telling us, Chad, that Governor Abbott might be inching toward reversing that decision he made, pretty controversial, on resettlement of refugees. We'll have the details on that going forward at quorumreport.com. You can sign up for our free emails where we send you real news, not fake news, at quorumreport.com.
Very nice. Scott, as always, appreciate your time.
Thanks, my friend. Talk next week.
Enjoy it, Scott. We'll talk to you next week. That's Scott Braddock, editor of Quorum Report.